The mud of Clover Ridge had a particular character in the autumn. It was not the thin, soupy mud of spring, but a thick, cold, and grasping clay that sucked at the hems of skirts and the wheels of wagons. It smelled of wet earth and decay and the coming frost, a smell that settled deep in the lungs. Timber buildings, their newness already scoured away by sun and snow, lined a single main street that felt more like a temporary truce with the wilderness than a permanent victory. The mountains watched, vast and indifferent, their peaks already white. It was a place of quiet endurance, and Nora Hale understood endurance. She understood it in the muscles of her back and in the constant, low-level ache in her hands. At 26, she felt both older than her years and strangely unfinished, a structure whose architect had left midway through the job. The death of her parents 3 years prior had not broken her, but it had left her in a state of perpetual stillness, running their small homestead on the edge of town with a competence that was both her shield and her cage. Her world was one of textures and smells. The rough slip of chicken feed through her fingers, the sharp scent of lye soap, the yielding softness of well-worked dough. It was in the dough that she found the truest connection to what was lost. The sourdough starter, housed in a stoneware crock her mother had carried all the way from Ohio, was a living thing, a bubbly, sour-smelling legacy. It was older than she was, and she tended to it with the reverence of a priestess. The loaf she prepared for the harvest fair was not like the others. She knew this before she even slid it from the oven. It was her mother's recipe, a dark rye sourdough, heavy and honest and deeply brown. It was bread with a history, its flavor complex and demanding, not a simple, pleasing bite. It was the color of the good soil down by the creek, dense with the memory of hard winters and the promise of sustenance. She wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, the warmth seeping through into her hands. It was a foolish thing, she knew, to bring this loaf. The women of Clover Ridge, the wives of ranchers and the mercantile owner and the blacksmith, they baked a different kind of bread. Theirs was a bread of aspiration. Pale, soft, airy loaves shaped in identical pans, a testament to refined flour and predictability. Her loaf was an outlier, a stubborn refusal to conform, and it would be seen as such. From his position leaning against a support post of the livery stable, Calhoun Reed watched the town prepare for the fair. He was a man defined by motion. His life was a series of dusty trails, cattle pens, and hotel rooms that all smelled vaguely of stale smoke and loneliness. He bought cattle for a consortium back east, a job that kept him perpetually moving between places like Crestfall and Teller's Creek, and here, Clover Ridge, a town he passed through once or twice a year. He was a quiet man, an observer by nature and by trade. He judged the worth of a steer not by its sound but by the look of it, the set of its shoulders, the clarity of its eye. He judged men much the same way. He had a stillness about him that was at odds with his transient life, a solidness that seemed to draw the world's frantic energy into itself and calm it. He had noticed Nora Hale on previous trips. He saw her in the mercantile, her list written on a scrap of paper, her purchases practical and few. He saw her walking the road to her homestead, her stride steady and her gaze fixed on the distance. There was a self-contained quiet about her that he recognized, a quality he associated with things that lasted. He had never spoken to her beyond a nod, a shared acknowledgement of existence. He knew her name was Nora, and that she was alone out on the old Hale place. The town looked out for her. That was the consensus. But he saw that she did a fine job of looking out for herself. He watched her now, walking toward the town hall with a cloth-wrapped bundle in her arms. He noted the set of her jaw, a subtle tension that spoke of resolve. He was not a man given to whimsy, but he untangled himself from the post and followed the flow of people toward the hall, a vague curiosity pulling him along. The air inside the hall was thick with the scent of sugar and cinnamon, of roasted meats and fermentation. It was a celebration of abundance, a collective sigh of relief after a season of hard work. Tables groaned under the weight of pies and preserves. Quilts of dizzying complexity hung from the walls, and on a long table at the far end of the room sat the breads. Nora found a space at the very end. She unwrapped her loaf and set it down. It was just as she had imagined. A single dark island in a sea of pale, uniform perfection. The women of the baking circle, led by the formidable Mrs. Gable, whose husband owned the largest ranch in the valley, moved down the line. They were a flock of judges in starched aprons, their hands fluttering, their voices murmuring polite approvals. They did not murmur at Nora's loaf. They paused. Mrs. Gable's eyes flickered over the dark, cracked crust. She did not touch it. Her lips thinned into a line that was neither a smile nor a frown, but a verdict. The other women took their cue from her. A glance, a shared, silent understanding. They moved on. The silence was louder than any criticism. It was a wall, smooth and impenetrable. Nora felt a familiar, dull ache settle behind her ribs. It was not anger, not anymore. It was the simple, resigned pain of being misunderstood. She had not baked the bread for them, not really. She had baked it for herself, for the memory of her mother's hands, for the simple satisfaction of the work. But the public rejection stung nonetheless. It was a confirmation of her otherness, a neat and tidy label pinned to her chest. The ribbons were handed out. A blue one for Mrs. Gable's impossibly white bread, red for another, yellow for a third. Every loaf but hers received some small acknowledgement. She waited a polite interval, then quietly folded the linen cloth back over her offering. She was not going to be the one to say anything. She would take her failure home and eat it for supper. She retreated to a corner of the bustling room, the wrapped loaf in her lap, and tried to make herself small. Calhoun had watched the entire performance from the back of the tent. He saw the women's silent judgment. He saw the flicker of hurt in Nora's eyes before she shuddered it away. He saw the quiet dignity with which she accepted her dismissal. He was not a man who cared for frills. He had seen too much of the world to be impressed by appearances. He valued substance. He valued grit. And the dark, stubborn loaf on the table seemed to him the only honest thing there. He pushed off from the wall. The crowd parted for him slightly as he crossed the room. He was not a large man, but he moved with a purpose that commanded space. The low hum of conversation faltered as he approached Nora's quiet corner. The women from the baking circle turned, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He stopped in front of her. He did not speak. He simply looked down at the bundle in her lap, then met her eyes. She looked up, startled, her face pale. He gave a single, short nod, then reached down. His fingers, calloused and sure, brushed hers as he took the wrapped loaf from her. He did not ask. He pulled back a corner of the linen, revealing the dark crust. With a decisiveness that was almost brutal, he tore off a substantial piece from the end. The sound ripped through the quieted room. He brought the piece to his mouth, his eyes never leaving hers, and chewed once. Twice. He was not tasting it. He was assessing it. A slow nod. It was a gesture of profound, unadorned approval. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried across the suddenly silent hall with absolute clarity. "That's the one I'm taking home." He meant the bread. The room understood it both ways. A current of shock passed through the gathered women. Mrs. Gable's mouth was a perfect, silent O. Nora felt the blood rush to her face, a hot, prickling wave. She could not breathe. She could not think. He was still looking at her, his expression unreadable, and then he reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 coins, placing them firmly in her free hand. It was more than the loaf was worth. The transaction was a public seal on a private declaration. He folded the linen back over the ravaged loaf, tucked it under his arm, and turned. Without another word, he walked out of the hall and back into the cold autumn air, leaving a wake of stunned silence and a single mortified woman holding 2 warm coins in her palm. Nora's walk home was a blur. The weight of the coins in her pocket felt heavier than the loaf had been. His words echoed in her head, over and over. "That's the one I'm taking home." It was absurd. It was audacious. It was the most terrifying and thrilling thing that had ever happened to her. She replayed the moment, the way he had looked at her, the certainty in his hands. He had not defended her. He had simply chosen her. There was a difference. A month passed. The leaves turned from gold to a brittle brown and skittered across the frozen mud of the main street. The memory of the harvest fair began to feel like a strange dream, a story someone else had told her. She had seen Calhoun Reed ride out of town the next morning, heading east, a string of cattle behind him. It was an isolated incident, she told herself. A strange impulse from a strange man. She baked her dark rye bread. She tended her chickens. She settled back into the quiet rhythm of her life. She almost believed it. Then, one crisp afternoon, he was back. She saw his horse, a familiar buckskin, tied to the rail outside the mercantile. There was no cattle sale. There was no business in town that she knew of. A knot formed in her stomach. Later, as she was splitting wood by her small house, she heard the steady tread of boots on the path. He stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. He wore the trail on him like a second skin, a fine layer of dust on his hat, and a weariness in his shoulders. "Afternoon, Miss Hale," he said. His voice was the same low baritone she remembered. "Mr. Reed?" she replied, her own voice tight. She rested the axe head on the chopping block, her hands gripping the handle. "I didn't know there was a sale on." "There isn't," he said simply. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the bare aspens. It was not an awkward silence, not entirely. It was a weighted silence, a space where things were being considered. "Your well water holding up against the frost?" he asked finally. "It's deep enough," she said. "The roads to the east, are they clear?" "Mostly." Muddy past Crestfall. It was a conversation about nothing and everything. He was here. He had come back. His eyes roamed over her small homestead, taking in the neatly stacked firewood, the secure latch on the chicken coop, the smoke curling from her chimney. His gaze was appraising, the same way he'd looked at her bread. It was unnerving. His eyes settled on the porch, where her sourdough crock sat catching the weak afternoon sun. He saw the fine web of cracks near the base, a dark line that spoke of age and imminent failure. He said nothing about it. His gaze lifted, met hers for a long moment, and then he nodded. "Well, I'll be on my way." And he left. Nora stood by the woodpile long after he was gone, the axe handle cold in her hands. He had ridden 2 days out of his way to ask about her well water. The thought was so preposterous it made her feel dizzy. Another month passed. The first snows dusted the peaks and lingered. Nora found herself watching the road east. She hated herself for it, for the small, hopeful leap in her chest whenever a lone rider appeared in the distance. She was being a fool. He came back at the end of that month. He did not stop at the mercantile. He rode directly to her house. He had a heavy bundle wrapped in burlap tied behind his saddle. He dismounted and walked to her door, the package in his arms. She opened the door before he could knock. He held the bundle out to her. "Saw this in Ridgeback?" he said, his voice low. "Thought it might serve." She took it. It was heavy, solid. She worked the knot on the twine and pulled back the burlap. It was a sourdough crock. It was a deep, earthy brown, perfectly thrown, with thick, sturdy walls and no cracks at all. It was a thing of profound and simple beauty, a tool, a vessel for the work she did. She looked up at him, her throat tight. He could have brought flowers, which would have died. He could have brought candy, which would have been eaten and forgotten. Instead, he brought her this, a thing that understood her, a gesture that said, "I see your work. I see the thing you nurture, and I want it to be secure." "It's better than the one I've been using," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," he said. This was his courtship, not in words, but in deeds. Not in poetry, but in pottery. It was the most deliberate and deeply romantic thing any man in Clover Ridge had ever done. The town, which had been watching from behind its curtains and whispering over its fences, fell into a new kind of silence. The women who had dismissed her bread now watched her with a mixture of envy and awe. The silence was no longer about judgment. It was about concession. Nora Hale, the strange girl with the strange bread, had caught the eye of a man who saw what they had missed. But the world did not stop for a new sourdough crock. Life and the expectations of a small town continued. Mr. Davies, the owner of the mercantile, was a widower of some 5 years. He was a kind man, a pillar of the community, with a neat house and a predictable soul. He was also lonely, and he had decided that Nora Hale was a sensible choice for a wife. She was quiet, she was hard-working, and she had no family to complicate matters. His courtship began the way such things were supposed to. He stopped her after church, his hat in his hands, to inquire about her health. He brought her a small, tight bouquet of asters from his late wife's garden, presenting them with a formal little bow. The flowers were beautiful, but they felt like a photograph of a feeling, not the feeling itself. She put them in a jar of water, where they sat on her table looking both lovely and entirely out of place. He would call on her in the evenings, sitting stiffly in the chair her father used to occupy. He talked about inventory and freight costs and the upcoming town council meeting. Nora would listen and nod, her hands busy with mending, her mind miles away. He was offering her a life of safety, of respectability. He was offering her a place inside the very circle that had shut her out. It was everything a woman in her position was supposed to want, and it felt like a cage. One evening, Calhoun arrived for his monthly, unspoken visit to find Mr. Davies just leaving her porch. The two men nodded at each other, a curt, masculine acknowledgement of mutual existence and unspoken rivalry. Calhoun watched the mercantile owner walk down the path, his back straight and his purpose clear. Then he looked at Nora, standing in her doorway, and saw the small bouquet of wilting asters in the window. He said nothing. He did not ask who the man was. He did not mention the flowers. But a change occurred in his stillness. It was no longer calm. It was rigid. The observer, the man who moved through the world without tying himself to it, had found something he did not want to see claimed by another. The quiet space he had been building with Nora, one practical gesture at a time, was threatened by a man who played by the rules. Calhoun's thoughts that night were a tangled storm. He was a man of open spaces and clear horizons. He understood the value of a good horse, the weight of a gold coin, the heft of a side of beef. He did not understand the intricate, unspoken rules of courtship, of church socials and small bouquets. He had always been a man in motion, his attachments temporary by design. The thought of settling down had been a distant, abstract concept, like old age. But the image of Mr. Davies on her porch, of those flowers in her window, had created a fixed point of pain in his chest. It was an anchor, holding him in place, and the pull of it was agonizing. He saw Nora's face, her quiet resilience, the way she looked when she was listening, her head tilted slightly. He thought of the bread, the crock, the steady competence of her hands. These were not abstract concepts. They were real, and he was in danger of losing them because he had been moving too slowly. He had been slow, dangerously slow. He had assumed his presence, his repeated returns, were a statement clear enough. He had spoken in a language of crocks and repaired fences, believing she understood, but now a man who spoke the common language of flowers and polite calls was making his own claim. The next evening he did not wait. The sun was bleeding orange and purple across the western peaks as he walked up the path to her house. There was no package in his hands this time. There was only a hard-won resolve in his heart. He found her on the porch, a basket of mending in her lap, her fingers working a needle through the collar of a worn shirt. The dying light caught the auburn threads in her brown hair. She looked up as he approached, her own expression as tense as his felt. They stood in the charged silence of the twilight, on the porch that had become the stage for their strange, unspoken affair. "Roads will be freezing over soon," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. It was a beginning. "They always do," she replied, her eyes not leaving his face. She set her mending aside. She was not going to be the one to say any of this first, but she was done waiting for him to find his words. The silence stretched. He looked at the mountains, at the dark line of the creek bed, anywhere but at her. It was Nora who broke it. Her voice was quiet, but it was as clear and direct as his had been in the town hall. "Mr. Davies has been calling on me," she stated. It was not an accusation. It was not a threat. It was a fact laid bare between them. "He is a good man. He has offered me a respectable life." She was giving him the truth. She was giving him a choice, and she was giving him his last chance. Her bravery was a physical blow. It cleared the fog from his mind. He finally looked at her, and the raw honesty in his eyes made her heart stop. "I have been slow, Nora," he said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. Too slow. He took a step closer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, as if to keep from reaching for her. "I am not a man for flowers. I am not a man for church socials and polite talk about the weather." He paused, gathering his thoughts, shaping them into the only words he knew. "I am a man who knows good stock when he sees it. Good land. A good horse." His gaze held hers, intense and unwavering. "A good woman." The declaration, when it came, was as simple and solid as he was. "I've been looking for a place to stop riding, Nora. I would like to stay in Clover Ridge. I would like to build a house by the creek, on that south-facing slope. But I will only do it if you will be my wife." He took a breath, the admission costing him everything and giving him everything in return. "I have a reason to stay now." Relief washed through Nora, so potent it almost buckled her knees. The tension that had lived in her shoulders for months finally eased. A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine, radiant smile that he had never seen before. It transformed her. "You got there, Calhoun," she said, her voice soft and laced with a gentle, loving humor. "It took you long enough." His answering smile was a hesitant, rusty thing, but it was real. "Yes." "Obviously, yes," she added, just in case he, in his slowness, had missed the meaning. Their official courtship was as practical as everything that had come before it. It was a partnership being built from the ground up. He did not bring her trinkets. He helped her rehang a gate that had been sagging for a year. She did not write him letters. She made him supper, and they ate at her small kitchen table, the new crock sitting on the counter like a silent, benign chaperone. They did not speak of love in poetic terms. They spoke of the future in board feet and acres. They walked the land by the creek where the house would go, and he talked about the morning sun, and she talked about the best place for a garden. Their conversations were about real things, about the foundation of a life, and in that, Nora found a romance deeper and more abiding than any sonnet. They were building something to last. The wedding was in late spring, when the mud had finally dried and the aspens were covered in a haze of pale green. It was a simple ceremony in the town hall, the same room where her bread had been scorned. Nora wore a dress of dark blue muslin she had sewn herself, It was the color of a twilight sky, simple and elegant. Calhoun stood beside her, his solid frame looking constrained and uncomfortable in a borrowed suit, but his hand, when it took hers, was steady and sure. The town was there. Mr. Davies sat in the second row, his expression one of polite resignation. Mrs. Gable and the other women of the baking circle were there too. As Nora and Calhoun walked out into the bright spring sunshine, husband and wife, Mrs. Gable met Nora's eye. She gave a single, stiff nod. It was a gesture of defeat, but it was also, finally, a gesture of respect. The silence had been broken. 5 years passed. The house by the creek was no longer new. The timbers had weathered to a soft silver gray, and climbing roses, which Nora had planted, were beginning to make their way up the porch posts. It was a house that had settled into the land, as solid and comfortable as the two people who lived within it. It was evening. Calhoun sat in a chair he had built, his boots up on the railing, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. Nora sat in a rocker beside him, her hands quiet in her lap for once. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. In the yard below, 2 children played. A boy of 4, with his father's quiet, observant eyes, was solemnly examining a beetle. A girl of 2, with her mother's determined little hands, was trying to pile pebbles one on top of the other. On a small table between them sat the remains of their supper, including a plate with a few slices of dark rye sourdough. Calhoun reached over, his movements as deliberate as ever, and took a piece. He chewed it slowly, thoughtfully, his gaze on the mountains. "Still the best bread in 3 counties," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet air. Nora smiled, a familiar, easy expression that lived on her face now. "You're just saying that because you have to." He turned to look at her, his eyes warm in the gathering dark. "No," he said, "I'm saying it because it's true." He held her gaze. "I've always known a good thing when I see it. Just took me a while to know what to do about it." She reached out and laid her hand on his arm. His was a love that did not need constant proclamation. It was in the solidness of the house around them, in the laughter of their children, in the shared, comfortable quiet that stretched between them now, no longer heavy with unspoken questions, but full and settled and deep. It was the quiet of a home. That is the thing about a true connection. It is not always forged in the fire of grand passions or declared in eloquent speeches. Sometimes it is built slowly, quietly, in the spaces between words. It is proven not with flowers, but with a new crock for a sourdough starter. It is a language of shared work and mutual respect, of seeing the value in what others have overlooked. Sometimes the most profound declaration of love is to simply look at an honest loaf of bread and the woman who baked it, and know, with absolute certainty, that you are taking it home.